basically we win as a team, we lose as a team, and how can we decide to be a more effective part of the team? And that's pretty near and dear to my heart. There's nothing better than a high functioning team. But it's hard to get there. And how do we all pull the rope in the same direction? So that was sort of advice I gave, but to get everybody there, including myself, right? We, again, back to this idea that we all have dug in paradigms, and to listen to each other and to empathize and to work together of the biggest bottlenecks to the next layer and level of success. But yeah, that'd be my answer. And getting there, advising versus getting there are two different things, and it doesn't matter what the advice is, right? So we all gotta do our part.
Swine it. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Swine It podcast. I'm your host today, Trey Kellner, and I'm excited because today we're joined by Dr. Steve Kitt. Dr. Steve Kitt. Steve, why don't you introduce yourself and tell our listeners what you'd like to know about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, Trey, thanks for having me on today. My background is raised in Western Iowa on a corn, soy, pig, cattle, and I remember even a few sheep around at one point in time. And from there, went to Iowa State and got a degree in animal science, and wasn't real sure what I wanted to do at that point in time. And I had had aspirations to be a veterinarian, like a lot of us do that were raised some time ago, probably before the internet, when we didn't know what else a professional would do in the livestock industry. But I had an older brother that went to grad school in agronomy and kind of coached me through the pros and cons of that. And so I ultimately started looking around for graduate school opportunities and ultimately kind of landed at Nebraska, kind of through the interview process, and ended up getting a master's and PhD at Nebraska. And from there, always knew I would want to end up in the industry. Really, teaching and in the academic world really probably isn't a great fit for me. Don't have those sort of skill sets. And so, and love really the economics and the people in the industry. And so ended up from there getting a job in the feed, a couple different stints in the feed industry, living in the Des Moines area for a while. And one of our largest customers was Pillin Family Farms, and that ultimately ended up being recruited to Pillin Family Farms, and spent 8 years at Pillin Family Farms, the role there, and then was really to internalize formulation. As I was talking about research, kind of got my wish one night when a farm burned down, and one morning Jim came in and said, "You still want your research farm?" I said, "Yeah, why?" He said, "Well, we've got a farm that just burned to the slats. We're going to rebuild. What should we do?" And so that was the start of at least the commercial research at Pillin Family Farms. Obviously, at that point in time, the Pillin family, or Jim, was really the lead of Danbridge genetics, which evolved into DNA genetics. And so during that stint, I was also charged with feeding the nucleus and, to some degree, a small number of multiplication level animals. Then from there, about five and a half years ago, I had a consulting group that tapped me and asked if I would be interested in looking at something different. And so the last 5.5 years spent with a small consulting group, where basically part of our business was consulting with pork producers anywhere from formulation to research to looking at production numbers, barn walkthroughs, et cetera. But the other portion really serving as a technical advisors for various allied industry groups. And so that was a lot of fun, really reconnecting with a lot of peers in the industry, and had a lot of fun with that. And then kind of this winter, spring, had some discussions with the Pillen family and convinced me to come back to Pillens to really serve. Right now, serving is probably more of a, I would say a on-staff consultant, if you will. Really no direct vision for what the job is, but really identifying gaps, opportunities, and looking for ways to plug in and improve profitability and opportunities within the system. In addition to that, serving on an internal commercial research committee as well. And so that's kind of my background, and live in Columbus, Nebraska, have for 13 years, have a beautiful wife and 3 kids. So life's good. So
we have a time and labor-saving product for you. AgriSlats by Healthy Farms is your solution. No more lugging jugs around the barn every month. With AgriSlats, you simply drop the slat through the floor twice a year, and it works to break down solids, reduces crusting and forming. To learn more, visit myhealthyfarms.com.
Yeah, that's awesome, Steve. So let's kind of start big picture within this conversation. So in your current role, in your past roles, you've been on internal leadership teams and you've been an external consultant. And I'm sure as you're making those big decisions, a lot of teamwork's involved. And then you have to make those decisions to make sure that they're applied at the slat level. So throughout your history and career, are there 2 or 3 gleanings that you'd like to pass on to our listeners in terms of, how do you make decisions? How do you work as a team to make decisions? And then how do you work as a team to implement those?
yeah, those are really good and oftentimes complicated questions. I would say first and foremost, it's important. I think every business has its own culture and style or maybe degree of risk. And so I think and bottlenecks within its business. So I think oftentimes it's important before we start making decisions, we try to understand and kind of like what I'm doing now with Pillens is looking through how do we benchmark relative to others? Where are our cost centers? Where are profit centers? Where do we try to either leverage or extract more value from this category versus that category? So, but back to kind of the degree of risk, I find that some groups, some companies, don't want to spend a nickel per pig without validated research. Others are more willing to take risks of maybe it's more 25, 30 cents a pig if that's appropriate for their business. And so I think it's really important to be aligned, I guess is my point, with the teammates and the leadership within the organization. And as a consultant, it was really important trying to fish that out and identify their comfort level. I'd say that's probably equally important sooner than later to try to fish that out with as an employee within a business. And so I think that's critical because you end up chasing small things if you're not careful and not appropriate, not aligned within a business, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. So Steve, if we could drill down further on that. So one thing that I found particular is being aligned, right? Especially with the team culture, the company culture. As an individual within a team, how do you strike that balance between providing value or maybe pointing things out without being confrontational? What successes have you found there? What failures have you found there as well, Steve?
Yeah. First off, I use the word confrontational. I think confrontation's healthy, right, as long as it's done right and professionally. And I think it's important that everybody kind of in the room and at the same table understands that confrontation's healthy, and so that we're aligned in that regard. But yeah, so I think it's okay to challenge each other. So for example, if you've got a business that I think we'd all agree that the last 2 years has been pretty difficult from a standpoint of PRRS infection rates and livability within our industry. And that's really kind of, sustainability, within the pork board and other, places have talked a lot about how do we improve livability within our industry. So if that's the biggest gap and opportunity, and you're a nutritionist, I've oftentimes struggled with, well, really, how much influence can I have there? But I think it's okay if we look within the literature, network with other folks, and align ourselves with, say, the veterinarians are charged with improving health and livability, to kind of saddle up next to them and figure out ways and opportunities to either research or to try and to look at opportunities. I think it's important with that example that even though, right, so in graduate school, we were not trained to look at economics real in depthly, and to use this livability example, I was never taught how to calculate the cost of production as it relates to mortality. But over time, through the School of Hard Knocks, working with business folks, you learn that is the number one, right? I think I cite all the time Greg Bilbrey's presentation at Layman Conference, I think in 2012, where it was clear that sorting through, doing a regression analysis with AgriStats data, that mortality, or said maybe in a more positive light, that livability is the number one opportunity of or the cost of production. So, but then you start kind of forcing yourself to build calculators. That's one thing in grad school we got pretty good at, right? Was Excel spreadsheets to think through, well, what is my cost? How much a cost have I accrued up until a 25-pound pig or a 50-pound pig or a 300-pound pig? And same way for sows and looking at whether it's or neonates on pre-wean mortality. And so I think maybe to round out, really kind of to answer your question more directly, I think our skill set as a nutritionist isn't so much innately knowing or being trained to know how to reduce mortality, but maybe we've been trained to merge economics with associated inputs or maybe drag in performance. And so it lends us to be able to saddle up with those folks and say, well, this is the cost. Maybe you can help us, or the lost opportunity. You can help us if there's an investment imposed here. How do we merge those two? Is there at least a 2-to-1 ROI? Is there a 3-to-1 or 5-to-1, whatever that might be, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that does make sense, Steve. Yeah, thanks for that answer. So to build a little bit on your first answer, as you're kind of introducing yourself, one unique thing that you did, Steve, was kind of the first internal nutritionist, and you kind of designed a research program based around production and nutrition from scratch. What did you learn through that process? And now as kind of an internal consultant, and 6 to 9 months ago as an external consultant, how do you then view research today, whether it's academic or it's at a BSL-2 level facility or a big side-by-side trial that may have 100,000 of pigs? What have you learned through kind of your research career as you've either interpreted data or generated data yourself to then apply to feeding programs?
Yeah, it's a good kind of a broad question, but I would say that, if I go back in time, the first research barn that was built at Pillen, it was important to us to try to mimic the system. And part of that is probably the first step in all of that was networking with those that have been there, done that, have built research barns. What have they done? What would have they done differently? And then ultimately it fell into like, here's our wish list, but what was realistic from a budget standpoint, right? So there was definitely things that got cut that, in hindsight, wished maybe we could have dug a little bit deeper and that sort of thing. But so things like we wanted pen size to be at least comparable. We wanted stocking density to be at least comparable, but I knew in the back of my head, if anything, we were going to stock a bit tighter so that it wasn't, well, that's research. Those pigs get Oreos and get patted on the head every day. It was also feeder style and feeder space was very comparable, but again, if anything, it was going to be a little bit tighter than the commercial system. Those are the sort of things. The other little things that I think everybody needs to think about is like water style, but then like gating, right? If you're going to try to do wean to finish production, we had to retrofit and add a few more bars to the bottom of our gates. We also had to, make sure the feeders we at least had the ability to wean pigs into those barns and had the appropriate equipment that way. And then obviously like bins and that sort of thing. So those are getting into the granular discussion of a barn. But I would also say I have I think there's merit in all types of research. When you get into I have to be careful not to dismiss very academic research that gets limited number of pigs per pen, because I think all of us, especially those of us that are academically trained, realize that there's some things we can learn from a mode of action, or maybe this was maybe a screening type oriented study. So personally, maybe I quickly want to dismiss, but I think there's opportunity that we can learn from the very academic type research. In fact, I've often wondered if it wouldn't be advisable as opposed to blowing a study where we only get, in a given research site, if we run it feeder to finish 2.4 turns a year, should we have a small site that has some screening opportunities to be able to look at whether it's some health challenge stuff, or these are very kind of pie in the sky type questions, but we don't want to burn a turn on that sort of thing. The other unique thing we have here at Pillins that I think other systems could leverage is we have very big sites, and say, for example, 1,500 head barn sites. And so we have the ability to run A versus B. We never try to get more complicated than that, but A versus B, say a control versus an additive, for example, where if done right, and as we communicate with the mill or whatever treatments we're imposing, try to do some validation that we know, at least by and large, the additive in this example might get put in correctly by testing diets after the fact, utilize either the barn or the site as the experimental unit. And I know, Trey, you've done some of that, and I don't think any of us, they're not easy to pull off. One has to think about, how do we block by flow, or how do we do it within flow? There's a lot of things we try to account for, but I think there's some validity to those. Now, again, they're not for the faint at heart, but I think there's a lot of validity. And unfortunately, we can't do things like titrations like we can do in very controlled, managed research. So hopefully that got to some degree of answering your question. I think on the front end of any the development or the design of a research barn needs to be well thought out in advance. Take your time, be fairly methodical, network with others, work to think long-term strategically, because once it's built, you're kind of stuck with it, right? There for sure will be things you wished you would have done differently, but hopefully that list is pretty limited, because it is a long-term investment. But a wise investment, because there are certainly some big nuggets that can be extracted and validated within a system.
Yeah, Steve, maybe talk about then once the data is generated, then how do you go through that decision tree process of saying, okay, this is going to be applied, right? So do you have that written down? Have you worked with systems that has that written down? Or is that just kind of an internal check, and then it's open for discussion within those leadership, teams of saying, hey, we're going to apply this strategy, or we're going to change this feeding program in this direction? What have you used in the past, and what are you currently using to help make major decisions based off the data that you generated internally?
Yeah, that's really what it's about, right? So we designed a trial to the best of our ability. We executed the trial to the best of our ability, and then obviously you get the results. And so then it's applying appropriate within a system economics, and that needs to be formalized. I would tell you that it could always be more formalized, probably in every system. But what I would say, I think the key to that is, right, we measure growth, performance, feed disappearance, ultimately feed efficiency, cost per pound of gain, and income over feed cost. Probably the limitations become in some of these studies is how did we account for, and this is becoming harder and harder, and not to go down a rabbit hole today, but collecting carcass data. If we don't collect carcass data, right? That we don't get the whole answer. And I think that's fairly important. So it really is about, in a production system, about hung pounds of carcass relative to the input costs. And so whatever trial we might have done, I think that's important. And so that's wean to finish or feeder to finish studies. Obviously in sow studies, maybe the next layer of discussion needs to be, did we follow those animals through, the subsequent parity? Again, not easier said than done, but to your point, to your question, is once we have assembled all that information, I think we need to roll it up into an executive summary. Those of us that are technically trained, probably one of our weaknesses of our training is there's a lot of jargon. How do we simplify the jargon so that it's not, we don't have to do a lot of explaining at the executive level, and then it's boiled down to one or two or three metrics that we might debate to say, do we want to apply or not? And I think I would venture to suggest that maybe every company, every production system should have really a committee. And here there has been a committee formed where all that data is assembled, all the economics are boiled down, there's an executive summary. That team, and probably an individual within that team, is accountable for getting all that information rolled up and pulled together and then presented to really senior leadership. And then I think senior leadership can have a discussion and pull the trigger. I would like to think that, so for example, we look at income over feed costs, it would be nice if it were, right, the income of that is a bit sloppy, right? The costs are easily measured in research and in production. The income sometimes is debatable, right? So there might be times where, right, this is no surprise to any of our listeners, but right, in the summer, we typically expect $90 to $110 hogs, right? Fall, winter, not so much typically, right? So we probably owe it to leadership to walk through and give maybe multiple scenarios of when there is an adequate return on investment for the amount of spend in a given intervention or strategy of whatever was imposed in that experiment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always provide feedback to some of our suppliers on, when they question, how do some things get incorporated and others don't, when they kind of have the same data robustness behind them. One of those things is, if you're able to reduce costs, it's a lot easier within a team and a leadership team for that strategy or that technology to get through, versus in a return over investment play, as you just described, right? Because that return or the income can always fluctuate, right?
Right.
It might be constant, but that income can vary. So it may work in a research setting, P less than 0.05, right? But, in an economic setting, it may only work, 4 out of 10 times or 2 out of 10 times. And does the system have the flexibility to then adjust to meet those 2 out of 10 times, right?
Right.
Then the second thing I found helpful within those executive summaries, and that's a really great point that a lot of us need to be better at, I've started to use start, stop, or keep at the very top. So we should start doing this, we should keep doing this, or we should stop doing this. And then after we've reviewed it, then I'll put, we have started, we have stopped, or we have kept, based off of this research finding, basically. Just what's the action item here, right? So
yes. Yeah, so you hit on a really good point. I think if we walk out of any meeting without action plans and timelines, it was probably a waste of time, right? And it doesn't matter if it's a research committee, working with our production teams, going through closeouts, all those sort of things. What are some 1 or 2 or 3 action plans? Who's tied to that action, and when do we expect that action to be followed up on? And it's not to be right ornery, but I think that's an effective business strategy to really go down. So
yeah. So Steve, before we get to kind of our last fun questions here, I want to ask you, in your new role, looking at the next 6 to 9 months and how bleak it currently looks economically, what things do you think that you've identified and maybe the listeners on this podcast who are in the exact same position should be thinking about and identifying, if they haven't already, to help kind of survive and get through in the best possible situation between now and next summer?
Yeah. And I probably won't point out any like specific items, but I mean, really anything that's gonna, anything that isn't necessary is being highly scrutinized right now. And I'm not speaking to research. I'm speaking more from an accounting production perspective, right? And so we've gone back in anywhere from like diets to coveralls to boots to really say, okay, what can we get by with? Are there alternatives? What can be done? And those are hard things for everybody, but necessary in these times, because these are pretty tough times, right? From a research perspective, I think the things that are going to the top of the list versus the bottom of the list are things that can help reduce cost as opposed to increase revenue, right? So what are the things that are the drivers of feed efficiency, right? It's probably becoming pretty redundant on this podcast and everything else, but what are all the things, and really combing through all of the production data and practices to better understand. I mean, so for example, scrutinizing all the closeouts or even active groups right now that are out of bounds in terms of feed disappearance relative to age. I know you talked about that in one of the podcasts. And so are there things going on there that we need to understand better? But really anything oriented to costs are, I think, important. So feed efficiency, but again, mortality, right? Mortality is the number one drag on cost of production. No doubt feed's the number one cost. And so things that are driving, we recently did field experimentation and we'll be monitoring through SPC charting some decisions on some interventions. And so things that are influencing mortality are important as well. So I'd like to, so through that filter of research, I'd love to wave a magic wand right now and say, we need to test and then ultimately someday apply pelleting as an example. The problem becomes that one becomes very multifactorial. How realistic? So in your filter of research, how realistic is it in the next 2 years to be able to apply pelleting to our system? And the reality is it's not. The other thing is that becomes pretty multifactorial. How do you make a good pellet if you're going to make one? What's the influence on things like ulcers and mortality rate, that sort of thing that then can offset your investment. So it's really everything around feed efficiency, cost, and maybe validating some of the major things we've made in changing up some of the biologicals in terms of cutting costs. You know, do they give us the same sort of responses? So
it's time for our famous three. Evonik Animal Nutrition is committed to ensure food security and safety while reducing the ecological footprint of animal farming. Its products and services use evidence-based solutions that seek to promote animal welfare and reduce reliance on natural resources. All this is underpinned by long-standing industry partnerships and deep customer understanding. Evonik's focus on efficiency, sustainable, healthy nutrition, and collaborations with livestock farming partners creates value for customers and consumers.
4 questions to end on here. The first is, what's the biggest hurdle you've overcome that you're the most proud of, Steve?
Oh boy, I wasn't expecting that one. I think I'm going to say, so if you get back to personality styles, and we talk a lot about personality styles here, so I would be controller, which means like I study the snot out of something, but once I've made a decision, man, I'm dug in. And I would say being more, I through the school of hard knocks, and what I'm thinking about is in the PED days, when, well, there's no way a virus could be infecting through feed, right? Boy, oh boy, in 2013, 14, whenever that was my paradigm rocked and changed ultimately. But in the interim, I think I was fighting pretty hard that this can't be the case. And so what I would say is I think that taught me a life lesson, that be more open to the things that you hold dear as a paradigm, and be willing to think outside the box and be more open when others bring, even if it's anecdotal information to you. So.
Yeah. Second, what's your favorite pork recipe?
Pork recipe. Oh boy, that's an easy one. I would say a whole pork loin. Well, you can cut it in half because our family probably can't eat a whole one. And inject it with I don't even know what it's called. Basically, this I call it fake butter from Hy-Vee. Just inject the crap out of it. It's like and then a slit down the middle, and real butter on top, and then a little bit of seasoning on top, and put it on the smoker for whatever 45 minutes or whatever to get it to 145. In my mind, that's better than filet mignon. So
that sounds amazing. Thanks for sharing. I'll have to try that here soon. Third, what's the best piece of advice or guidance you've given the past month?
Okay. Basically we win as a team, we lose as a team, and how can we decide to be a more effective part of the team? And that's pretty near and dear to my heart. There's nothing better than a high functioning team. But it's hard to get there. And how do we all pull the rope in the same direction? So that was sort of advice I gave, but to get everybody there, including myself, right? We, again, back to this idea that we all have dug in paradigms, and to listen to each other, and to empathize, and to work together of the biggest bottlenecks to the next layer and level of success. But yeah, that'd be my answer. And getting there, advising versus getting there are two different things, and it doesn't matter what the advice is, right? So we all gotta do our part.
Yes. Yeah. Talking and walking are two different actions, right?
Right.
Okay. So lastly, then, if there is one thing, Steve, and I know I've picked your brain a lot of times and have valued your mentorship throughout the years. So if there is one thing that you could pass on from your work or your career efforts here to our listeners, what would that be?
In one word, I would say humility. If you want me to expound upon that a little bit, I go back to, I think we go to scientific meetings, and right, we hear each other use big words. Part of it is I don't know many big words, but right, I think we run in danger zone when we come back home. We get into barns, and we want to look like the expert, but I think that actually divides people and divides teams. I think it's important that we use the vernacular and the words at the know your audience. So use the same sort of street words you might use with your buddies in the barn, right? When we go to animal science, then we can talk those sort of words. But yeah, that would probably be my biggest life lesson and piece of advice I try to impart on people.
Thanks for passing that along. Steve, thanks for your time today. This was a great conversation, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Swine It podcast, and I hope you check out other episodes and future episodes to come. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.